Hello, everyone. My name's Sara Gingold, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the DSC newsletter, and I'm also a person living with a disability. I'm going to be talking to you today about the new rules around the management of NDIS funding, which includes plan and self-management. The reason these new rules came into being is because many of you will know that a new NDIS Act was passed last year. And that Act includes criteria for when participants can't self-manage or they can't plan manage. So generally, if a participant has a request, like they want to either self or plan manage, the NDIA has to honour that, except in these specific circumstances. And some of these circumstances are objective, like they're things about like being declared insolvent or having a 2-year having committed a crime that had a 2-year prison service or something. But some of them are quite subjective, so they're around like if it would pose an unreasonable risk to the participant, or if the participant is unlikely to spend their funding in accordance with their plan and on NDIS supports. Now, the problem, as you can imagine, those are very subjective questions. So rules are kind of designed to give the NDIA more information about how they would operationalize these rules. Something that's quite complex and a bit annoying is that the rules kind of have two halves. So the first half is about whether someone's going to spend their funding as intended in the plan. And that part is with the Federal Register, it's the law. The other half is about unreasonable risk. That part, DSS has released, Department of Social Services, has released a summary of everything they want to include in that, but that it's still kind of being, that states and territories still have to agree, so it hasn't been put with the Federal Register just yet. What impact will these rules have? So for most participants, I would say probably not a lot. I think that most people probably won't have their request to self or plan manage challenge. And so, yeah, that's probably a bit of relief. But even if the request is challenged, there are safeguards and things you can do. So things that the rules say the NDIA has to consider are what supports exist around a person to help manage those risks. So if the NDIA thinks it's an unreasonable risk because of someone's financial literacy skills or something, well, then they might the participant could potentially say, well, look, I've done this financial literacy class, or I've got this person who's going to support me and help me through that. So one thing I would suggest is that if someone does have these supports around them, it's probably a good idea to document it. I know documentation can be a bit annoying. We all want to live our lives. We don't want to be documenting them, but it might help take the stress out of if you do find yourself in a situation where your ability to self or plan manage is being challenged. I think maybe it would be a good idea for me to talk through briefly how the new rules define whether someone's not going to spend according to their plan. So things they would potentially look at is the person's history of spending according to their plan, whether the person has complied with past requests from the NDIA for information, and if they haven't, if there was a good reason for why they haven't, if the person has a history of fraud or mismanaging funds, the person's capacity to manage their finances, taking into account the supports they have, which I think is a very important part. If the person has been subjected to exploitation or undue influence in the past, and also the participant can raise matters and that they want the NDIA to consider. And then there's a vague criteria that they can also just anything else the NDIA considers relevant, which is a bit of a keeping the options open criteria. And then the other half of the rules, which hasn't quite been finalised yet, but it looks like this is what it's going to say, are about unreasonable risk to participants, which is obviously a very challenging question because one person's unreasonable risk is another person's dignity of risk. But the rules say the NDIA must consider whether the risk can be managed through the supports in a person's plan or a person's informal supports or community supports. If the risks have been managed in the past, which is where it's really good to have documentation, you can be look, see, we did all these things, we put all these things in and it's worked. So again, the extent that the participant is at risk of experiencing financial exploitation or influence or pressure, the person's ability to manage money again, and whether there has been a court order relating to the participant's finances. So that might be in situations where the person has a guardianship order, and that guardianship order specifically deals with the person's finances. Then the NDIA might make would probably align the plan management with the guardianship order. So they might make the guardian the self-manager in that situation. And yeah, again, anything else the NDIA considers relevant or the participant asks the NDIS to consider. In terms of what this means for plan managers as well, so again, the NDIA can say it's too much of a risk for someone to use a plan manager if they think that would result in the person not spending their plan or the plan manager paying for supports that aren't in accordance with the plan or NDIS supports, or again, if it's an unreasonable risk. But again, they have to take into account ways that risks can be mitigated. And one example they give is that maybe if a participant can't access the internet to approve invoices, that's maybe something a support could do with them. So yeah, again, I think it will come down a lot to documentation. One thing that's interesting to consider is that the rules do say that the NDIA can't take into account the nature of a person's impairment. So they can't say because the person has an intellectual impairment, they can't self-manage. But there is a but, they can take into account the impact of that impairment. So if they believe that a person can't self-manage because of their intellectual impairment, they can take that into account. The other thing that they need to consider when working out unreasonable risk is about the types of supports that are in a person's plan. So if there are supports that a participant needs, to stay alive, then they would be considered high-risk supports. And then the likelihood of unreasonable risk might be greater than a lower risk support that isn't necessary for survival. But if the NDIA does believe that there is it's too great a risk for a person to manage their higher risk supports, what they can do is they can just make the high risk supports a plan or agency managed, but let the person self-manage their other supports. So it doesn't have to be for the entire plan. Another important thing to know is that everything around decisions like this about plan or self-management can be appealed. So people can, if they disagree with a decision the NDIA makes, they can take that they can request an internal appeal, and if the internal appeal doesn't go the way they want it to, they can take it to the new Administrative Review Tribunal. I had to remember to get the name right because it's changed from the AAT to the ART. In terms of advice, I would give the self-managers who might be concerned about these rules, I would say the most important thing is that knowledge is power. So make sure you're familiar, which hopefully you are at the end of this video, with what, and if anything is coming up to you that it might be a bit of an alarm bell in the future, or it might create an issue for you in the future, then I would start either documenting supports you've already got in place to mitigate the risks, and also if you don't have supports in place, looking at what supports are available, potentially requesting supports from the NDIS that might help you self-manage in the future as well. But yeah, just trying to get ahead of it as much as possible. But like I said, I imagine for most people, the status quo in the law is that people have the right to choose how they manage their fund. And there will be some people impacted by the new rules and some of the circumstances where the NDIA can say that someone can't. But for the most part, for most people, it should be okay. The other thing to maybe do if you're a self-manager is there is that thing about if someone's been subject to undue influence and or exploitation in the past, and that's quite broad, because the NDIA can consider, even if that person who is maybe committing the financial exploitation is no longer in the person's life, the NDIA can still look at what's happened in the past. But another thing I would do if you've been in that situation is document what's changed since. So document why you wouldn't be in that situation again, because they will they're meant to take into account what's happened since then. I still have a lot of questions about process around this, and I think there will probably at some point be more operational guidelines. I have questions around A, the types of evidence the NDIA would ask for, and B, where the kind of onus of proof is, whether the NDIA has to establish that they have evidence for why someone can't self or plan manage, or whether they can just raise the question and look at the evidence the participant responds with. We don't know yet, but again, I think for the most part, people will just go through with their request, and this will not be an issue. I guess one thing you could do if you are worried, if anything does alarm you, is DSS has something on their website that you can write to them with your feedback on how to implement this rule. So not the rule itself, but how to implement it. But the half that hasn't been put to the Federal Register yet, they're not specifically asking for consultations on it, but you could give it. It's the same email. I've emailed them questions before. And they actually get back in a semi-reasonable time frame. You could also, as these rules are being negotiated with states and territories, you could potentially contact the disability minister in your state or territory.